It's been almost a year since Singapore's largest ever money laundering case came to light. 10 suspects were rounded up and all have been convicted. The 10 have each been sentenced to between 13 and 17 months in jail. And given the eye-watering amount involved in this case, there have been many questions, ranging from the penalties meted out to its reputational impact on Singapore. So let's get the view of the experts.
So in terms of number, 3 billion looks like a big number, but if you compare with other money laundering scandals overseas, I mean, some of them are a few hundred billion, right? But I think what is really interesting is, I think in some of these other cases, banks were kind of used as conduits. But in this case, I think what is interesting is it's not only a conduit, right? Because we became a destination for a lot of this money, right? And then that infiltrated the whole economy and went into buying properties and fancy cars and precious metals and so on. And to me, it has a lot of repercussions because there's a social cost to it too. I think when illegitimate money comes into our economy and then start driving up cost of living in a way, right?
What may not be so apparent is that every individual has their own mitigating factors. Many of them, I believe, spend quite a lot of time in remand, waiting for their cases to be heard. And all that remand time has to be taken into consideration. There were large amounts of property that were seized. Internally, there could have been some agreement that these properties were then confiscated by the state, the prosecution, and ultimately the courts have to take all these and many other factors into consideration when calibrating what would be a fair sentence for each individual. And so, whilst I can appreciate someone saying, oh, it does seem a bit low, we may not all be in possession of all the facts of the case, and of course all the different factors which go to calibrating a fair sentence.
So let's talk about the longest and the shortest sentences. The longest jail term, 17 months, was given to Su Jianfeng. He pleaded guilty to possessing more than 550,000 Singapore dollars in criminal benefits and fraudulently using a property sale contract to explain the source of about 2 million Sing dollars that found its way into his bank account. Another 12 charges were taken into consideration for sentencing. The shortest jail term of 13 months was given to Wang Baosen and Su Wenqiang. Wang was convicted on 2 counts of money laundering, with 6 other charges considered in sentencing. Su was also convicted on 2 counts of money laundering, with 9 charges taken into consideration.
Sometimes an accused person faces more than one charge. He may have a series of charges. It could be even charges that go into the hundreds. It's not always practical to prosecute somebody on every single charge that has been preferred against him. Sometimes in a trial situation, what the prosecution might do is to just stand down. Some of the charges proceed on the charges where they have the strongest evidence. What happens is that these charges are still before the courts, but a person is not sentenced for TIC or taken into consideration charges. For an example, you have 3 charges of shoplifting. The prosecution says, look, we'll just proceed on 1 charge, because that's enough to prove their case. But the court, in assessing culpability, assessing the harm, and calibrating what type of sentence, can say, look, so I take the fact of the 2 other charges into consideration when I'm calibrating this sentence for this charge.
What sort of weight do these TICs carry when it comes to sentencing? Does it vary case to case?
It depends on, 1, the seriousness of the TIC charges, and 2, the connectivity to the main charge. So, for example, if in some cases, if the TIC charges themselves are quite serious, or they involve a lot of money, then I think that would increase the culpability of the accused person. In some cases, the TIC charges are very minor and maybe a prelude to the main offence. And I think the court will give very little weight to those kind of minor charges. So I think It's not a formula. It is sometimes a bit of an art, sentencing.
Now, the sentences of the suspects were backdated to their date of remand, that's mid-August last year. All of them have completed their jail terms and they've been deported, and they're also barred from returning to Singapore.
If an accused person is sentenced, that sentence is only for the accused person. Family members, children of the accused are not punished by the courts unless they themselves are seen to be involved in the predicate offence. And ultimately, it is ICA which determines whether a person can be allowed to stay in Singapore. They would work closely with the investigators also, because the investigators may still find a need to interview, speak to other family members, especially the case is ongoing. Nobody wants to keep anybody in Singapore unnecessarily.
And what's going to happen to the assets seized? Of the 3 billion Sing dollars involved in this case, about $1 billion worth of assets was linked to the 10 offenders. Of these, the offenders agreed to forfeit between 90% and 100%. That's about 944 million Sing dollars. The non-cash assets such as cars and jewelry will be sold via channels such as auctions. The proceeds, along with the forfeited cash, will go into Singapore's consolidated fund. You can think of it as a bank account that's held by the government. As for the properties, a new law was proposed in July to allow the courts to order the sale of seized properties linked to suspected criminal activities. Now, currently, law enforcement agencies must get the consent of all involved parties before they can get the court order. But wait, what about the other 2 billion Sing dollars worth of seized assets? Well, they come from 17 suspects who are still on the run. The assets will be held in police custody until the suspects have been dealt with by Singapore's courts. So now that we've got that, the next big question is, how does this case affect Singapore's reputation as a clean business hub?
The world kind of look at this and say, wow, Singapore looks very good on the outside with all the rules and regulations, and how could something like this happen, right? So I think reputationally there's an impact, and of course when something like this happens, then some people may say, so what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that once you are tainted like this, it can affect kind of our place in the financial system in terms of people undertaking cross-border transactions, or even foreign investment, right, coming in. If you have too much of this, it could discourage legitimate businesses, right, from doing business through Singapore.
On October 3rd last year, about 1.5 months after this case came to light, Singapore's government said that a new interministerial committee would be formed to review and strengthen Singapore's anti-money laundering regime.
I think when people look at the very large, staggering quantum of the 2.8 billion in this case, they might draw the wrong conclusion about the state of money laundering in Singapore or the adequacy of our regulatory regime. But this really couldn't be further from the reality, because this case is a culmination of 2 years of painstaking planning. But we can always do better. And I think that what we have been outlining here today is we have been saying that we can do better in regulating gatekeepers like the lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, especially through prevention, detection and enforcement, as well as other prongs of our anti-money laundering strategy. And that is what the IMC, or the Interministerial Committee, will be looking at.
It's really the nature of the beast. In that money laundering offences, by its nature, they are very difficult to detect. And people go through ways of trying to hide how the money, the source of funds are shown in Singapore. So it's not a Singapore problem. Money laundering is a worldwide problem. The Singapore legislation is good enough and strong enough. And even if you enhanced the legislation dramatically, you'd still have the problem of detecting and finding the offences.
But where else could Singapore improve?
One thing that always strikes me, right, is whether we could strengthen our whistleblowing protection. Singapore is one of the few developing and even developing countries, right, that does not actually have comprehensive whistleblowing legislation, right? So, I mean, there are assurances their identity will not be, disclosed in some legislation, but I just feel that it's not comprehensive enough.
So, what's next? While the 10 people involved have been convicted, it's not quite the end yet. Investigations are still ongoing against the 17 suspects who are not in Singapore at the moment. Do you have any more questions on this case? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to find out what happens next.